Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. This is, of course, a strange music show diving into, all sorts of different kinds of albums. There's, all sorts of different kinds of weird music, I feel, And I feel like, generally the vast majority of music is weird on some level, but some things are definitely more weird than others, right? So, in today's episode, I think this is we're looking at an album that I think is easily one of the most strangest albums I have ever heard of, and it's one that I came across when reading the fascinating liner notes for Jubilee by Robert Takahashi Crouch, an album we covered in a very long episode of one of the early episodes of Weird Music, actually. And this album, I think, without a doubt, since discovering it through Jubilee, is easily one of the most fascinating set of recordings I have ever come across in my many years of reviewing music. This is quite a journey, I have to say. I'll be honest, it's going to actually be quite difficult to both write and discuss this the more we get into it, but I believe it'll be worth it, though, especially... It's kind of hard to explain, actually, funny enough, just mentioning that, but yeah, I think it's worth it, giving it a shot. So, let's just dive into it. Today, I present to you Presque Rien by Luc Ferrari. So, before we dive into Presque Rien, let's ask ourselves, who is Luc Ferrari? Well, Luc Ferrari is a French composer of Italian heritage and generally regarded as a true pioneer in the world of music concrete and electroacoustic music. And Luc's career into the world of music composition on some level, it's truly fascinating, going as far back as the late 60s. And so what makes Luc Ferrari's music so special then? Well, Ferrari generally created works that I would argue completely blends together the sort of natural sounds of the everyday world with more abstract and surreal sounds as well, creating incredibly unique listening experiences that kind of have to be heard to be truly believed. And the most famous type of these recordings, though, is the ever-influential Presque Rien, a series translating to almost nothing that originates as far back as 1970. And the Presque Rien series was arguably a form of minimalist compositions that Ferrari explored across his entire career, essentially, starting with the very first release of Presque Rien No. 1. And Presque Rien's, certainly incredibly strange recordings that are truly difficult to explain, and thus I feel as much context actually as we can get is important, And so, in regards to Presque Rien, Luc Ferrari himself tells us the following. A Presque Rien is a homogeneous and natural place, non-urban, which has particular acoustic qualities, transparency and depth, where one hears far and near without excess, on the scale of the ear, like one says on a human scale, without technology, where nothing is dominating, so that the various sound inhabitants have each one their word, and the superposition of the small world of life never makes but an almost nothing. It might be a little bit lost in translation there, and to be fair, it's also one of those texts that, explains everything, but also explains it in a very, very, very weird way. So we try and take what we can from it. But yeah, we're clearly in for some incredibly strange stuff today, aren't we? And so I'll say, before we start diving into all the songs we're looking at today and stuff, I should mention that the specific album we're looking at today is a sort of compilation album, combining a number of Presque Riens together into a full album experience. From my understanding, the Presque Riens was sort of released, as singles almost, and this album compiles some of the best ones, I feel, together. And so, whilst I have said before on the channel, I generally do like to look at things, as they were originally envisioned, their original release, if that makes sense. This particular compilation album ends up doing something incredibly interesting as a result of combining these specific tracks together. It was also my first occurrence of coming across both Luc Ferrari and the whole Presque Rien as a concept. When I first Googled it, essentially, this was the album that came up. This is the one I listened to first. And, it became an incredibly bizarre and absurdly noteworthy listening experience when I first heard it. Something I will no doubt ever forget, I feel. And so, let's discuss all the tracks then, shall we? So, beginning, Presque Rien starts with the first composition, which was the first composition released under the name Luc Ferrari. Presque Rien number 1, Le lever de jour à bord de la mer, which roughly translates to Almost Nothing number 1, Sunrise by the Sea. And so this is an incredibly interesting composition, both in the world of field recordings and found sounds, as well as an interesting recording to start this entire thing off. Just before we go into it, we've got a little brief bit of explanation on Luc Ferrari's website regarding this track. Following the complete disappearance of abstract sounds, we can regard this piece as a sonic snapshot and a culmination of an evolution. This is a realistic rendering, as faithful as possible, of a fishing village waking up. The first idea of minimalism. So what we essentially have here, a 20-minute track of gently mixed field recordings of the very occurrence of a small fishing village, Vele Luca, on the island of Korčula. And the essential recordings apparently came from an entire day of exploring the village and recording the sounds of the village as the day just occurred, essentially. Luc Ferrari walking around with his recording equipment, essentially. And it's interesting knowing full well where Presque Rien ends up. It's interesting starting off this whole project with a very minimalist recording of sorts that consists of just field recordings, just the sound of the people, the wildlife, the wind, the bugs, the machinery, just everything, everything that makes up life itself, and it all just occurs along gently without any real momentum. I can understand what Ferrari means when he mentions the first idea of minimalism on this one, as the entire recording has this incredible restraint in terms of just how it's coming across to us as a listener. As a result, it's a rather hypnotizing track, I would say, that just completely lulls you into this, peculiar false sense of security, I feel, as it just sounds like the occurrence of an everyday world all around us, albeit on a remote island out there far in, the world somewhere, it feels. And what is incredibly interesting, though, is when you're listening to something like this, your brain will just interpret and form and essentially make up its own understanding of what it is you're listening to, even going as far to find some level of musical melody through the occurrence of the very sounds themselves. It's so interesting because it becomes almost a natural soundtrack, a demonstration that there's a form of music happening all around us. And by distilling the village's ordinary sound into this 20-minute recording, we end up with this lovely narrative, that's very gentle in its progression. But what surprises me and amazes me about this recording, though, is the more you listen to it, the more it reveals about itself, like so many long-form field recordings, of course. But what's of particular interest to me is how, the combination of such an array of sounds results in a few peculiarities, the world itself revealing its own abstraction, perhaps, through the presentation of unusual sounds. It's very surreal at times, almost. But there's also this incredibly unusual normality to it as well, as it's just a presentation of a fishing village. And, it's really fascinating to listen to, I feel, especially when the sounds just start combining in very unusual ways and becoming these weird, like, droning elements or stuff, or these weird musical phrases almost. Like, it's the abstraction of the everyday world itself, I feel, and I think it's incredibly fascinating. A bit more about this though, and this will also give us a bit more context for the rest of the recordings though, but there is a specific point I haven't mentioned when it comes to Presque Rien number 1. So, when you're listening to this recording, it does feel like you're just listening to Luc Ferrari walk around this entire village, holding out his microphone and recording it all in real time. However, that's not how this recording was made. This composition is a composition. It was formed from a great many recordings, all stitched together into this one cohesive narrative that runs through the entire experience. It's every occurrence of a sound has all been recorded separately, I believe, and Ferrari has painstakingly edited it all together and constructed in a sense, it's almost a false narrative, actually, because technically this never occurred in the real world. And that is really interesting to think about, especially when the presentation of it gives it a naturalness to the everyday world. But in fact, not at all. But it sounds so much like it as well. It's going to start hurting your head the more you think about it and stuff. We will see more of this as well as we get into this album. But one thing as well, though, I think that's incredibly important about this process is it demonstrates such an incredible attention to detail, with Ferrari just, is painstakingly putting all the sounds there specifically, isn't he? With that in mind as well, it really opens up this entire composition into a new light, as I genuinely had no idea that this was the case when I first listened to it. I just listened to the album after downloading on Bandcamp, was listening because this is nice little field recording narrative. But it turns out there was so much more going on underneath the surface of it all, and I think it's fascinating. And as well, it's one of many, many mistakes I made when I first heard this album, as we will also discover soon enough. And so, Presque Rien moves on to the second composition. Presque Rien number 2, Allons-y continue la nuit dans la tête multiple, 1977, which roughly translates to Almost Nothing number 2, thus continues the night in my multiple head. And so, this is where things start to get a little bit fucky. I had no idea what was coming, and no way to predict it, and as such, listening to Presque Rien number 2 for the very first time was an absurdly interesting experience. And so, I'll say here now, if you want to be surprised by what this particular album does and is doing, then by all means, stop watching the video here, go and check out Presque Rien for yourself. There is a link in the Bandcamp to the Bandcamp below, and just have a listen to this and discover what the heck happens, because this review will spoil everything that's coming. But yeah, there is something truly wonderful yet absurd about listening to this album for the first time without any real indication of what you're listening to. So I would recommend that you go and listen to it. But if you also have heard this whole album before, or you don't care, then let's proceed. So, Presque Rien number 2. Let's imagine this scenario. You've been listening to this album. You have no context for anything that's going on. You're just listening to the album. You listened to the first track, gotten lost in the lovely composition of field recording, and got transported to a lovely fishing village in the middle of nowhere, had a lovely time there. And then you get to the second track, and the field recordings continue. So, put a pin in there. The accompanying text that comes with this track, it's rather different than what we had for Presque Rien number 1, as Presque Rien number 2 tells us the following. Description of a landscape at night that a sound man attempts to define through microphones, but the night surprises the hunter and creeps inside his head. It then becomes a double description. The inner landscape transforms the outer night, and by composing it, adds its own reality, a fantasy of reality, or perhaps a psychoanalysis of his nightscape. And so, an incredibly strange description of a track in general, but what does this mean? I don't know. It's an incredibly surreal piece of esoteric text that attempts to add context to what we're hearing, but it's also, adding much more to the mystery as well, perpetuating the mystery of the track in question. Very confusing, very weird to wrap my head around it, but we'll try go back to it in a bit. Let's discuss the surrealness of this track though, shall we? So the sound aspects, especially as this track starts off, you're getting insects gently chirping into the wide, vast landscape, which feels so wide and just expansive it feels when you first hear this one. Whilst a voice, who I assume is Ferrari, starts speaking very gently right up against our ear as cars drift by, and the vocalizations of birds occur. But there's something unusual that starts to happen. The more this track progresses, the more you become aware of the peculiarities, the surrealness. And this, begins, with the bird sound, You just get the vocalization of a bird, but then it starts to loop, creating this very weird occurrence where you're starting to get hypnotized and you're sort of unaware of things, of what is actually a surreal element, if that makes sense. And the more it goes on, the more surreal elements start coming through, you get weird creaking squeaks panning through your microphones. And then it's 12 minutes in, you get a very abstract musical notion, very reminiscent of this kind of things you might have heard on Basil Kirchen's Quantum, no doubt, an album we took a dive into on another early episode of Weird Music. And this, though, it's a very unusual moment on this album, as these peculiar sounds still occur during this musical moment. And if anything, it creates this incredibly creepy and unsettling atmosphere, where it feels like we've been transported into an alternative version of reality itself, one where everything is just slightly off and just skewed in a different direction. And it becomes, almost terrifying, it feels, right? But it's not the most terrifying part of this recording. Do not get me wrong, though. If you get completely absorbed by the recording and lost within this incredibly surreal soundscape, which gets very hypnotizing as it occurs, it kind of just lulls you into a false sense of security and you just end up, completely disorientated by the whole thing. But when I first heard it as well, I got really shocked by the sudden sound occurrence at 17 and a half minutes in. When I was first listening to this track, I remember being so shocked by that occurrence of a sound. It just happened so suddenly and loudly that it just woke me out from my stupor. And it set my heart beating so quickly. And then the track just ends up, just navigating itself into this really surreal passage that makes it really confusing and surreal to just sort of absorb and understand, if that makes sense. And it's such a weird sensation in there, but it's not even half as weird as the strange sound that accompanies the movements in this track, Like, the sound that you get at this point, I can only describe this, I think, as sort of a weird edited percussion, that's turned them, rather than being beat, it almost turns them into waves that bounce along the recording, resulting in this really peculiar and weird movement in the track. Like, it's so weird. But for me, this is where the strangeness of the recording starts to come through. The surreal elements, the abstractions, start to be much more apparent. And this is where, the penny starts to drop, that there is a lot more going on here than what is on the surface. That there's much more embedded deep within. And to go back to what he's saying as well, like, of course, when it comes to this track, I, as someone who doesn't understand French, sadly, I don't understand what Luc's actually talking about, but it seems he's most likely just talking about, just describing the very landscape itself. And then, as it all occurs, it just slowly becomes so much more abstract, and we can kind of see the narrative that's being presented through the text here of, the sound man, the hunter, and then the double landscape, perhaps, when everything just gets skewed and distorted and stuff, and the sort of, it's very difficult to put into words, but the sort of abstraction of reality itself, and then that in itself being what it is in a weird way, because this is what it sounds like. It's very confusing to get your head, like for me to get my head around. Like, it confuses me so much, but it's a fascinating track, I feel, and one of my favourites, I would say, as it feels worlds apart from Presque Rien No. 1. But this was the second iteration of the project, and this is when things get really interesting. Let's move on to the next track then, shall we? Presque Rien avec Filles, 1989, or Almost Nothing with Girls. So, this is the track for me where things got really strange and unusual. Like the second track, like the first track was strange but interesting, but it felt normal. It felt like a thing that was occurring. The second track, things got a little bit weird, but I just thought it was fine, you know. But this is when things got so unusual, and I remember so vividly the first time I heard this track and how strange I found the entire experience. So, the accompanying text that goes with this track, we're told the following. Within paradoxical landscapes, a photographer-composer is hidden whilst girls are having a sort of picnic on the grass. Without being aware of it, they offer him the spectacle of their intimacy. Right, so bit of a weird one there. I'll say, I don't know why, but I feel like there's something almost kind of perverse, you know, that in how this one, as though Luc Ferrari is literally hiding in a bush spying on these women. But there's also this kind of weird innocence to it as well when you hear it, if that makes sense. It's very unusual. Something also very playful and fun and absurdly strange and surreal in its own right, as we will no doubt get into. And so as it opens up, you sort of have this weird percussion, unusual sounds filling up the space within the headphones, transporting us to this alternative reality, this paradoxical landscape, you know? And with all the different sounds we hear, this one has me imagining that we've been turned into the tiniest creature, you know, as we start to traverse a very picturesque park of some kind, you know, through, you know, a close-up image of the leaves and the grass, you know, and all the sounds of the world and nature itself just occurring to us, you know, and being amplified as well, I would say, because, you know, being on such a tiny, minute scale. But there's a lot more unusual elements being used in this one, though, as it creates a very surreal experience for us when we end up in this completely alternative reality the more the track progresses. And so, it's on this one where things get super fucky. Like, I just think it's the perfect word to describe it, I'm sorry, but it just gets so weird. And so you have all these many natural sounds in nature occurring all around us, peculiar micro sounds placing us directly into the minute details of the foliage itself as the birds sing, and this is when things get really weird sounds. Like, I can only describe it as tiny micro sound explosions that I can only interpret to be the rumbling of some kind of drum roll that's been panned across the headphones in a really peculiar way. And it's truly a surreal experience, the more, that becomes all the more weird when you start getting those female voices speaking sporadically right up against our ear. It becomes such a peculiar, strange, out-of-body experience of sorts that really distorts our perception of reality itself for some strange and unusual reason. Especially as the track reaches its conclusion, of course. It becomes this sort of cacophonous overload of drums or percussion as the voice continues to just chat away, you know, just enjoying their company, having a nice time with each other. And it's so confusing, as this was the moment when I realised, when I first heard this album, that this wasn't a simple album of enjoyable field recordings, but altogether something else entirely. It's so surreal, so strange, and so wholly unique in its own right that I genuinely don't really know what to think or make of it, if that makes sense. Like, it's so weird. Like, every time I listen to this track, I just get bombarded with such an overload of occurrences and peculiarities that it confuses me so much. But that's also kind of the point. The confusion itself just seeps itself into reality itself somehow. And it makes it such a weird listening experience at times. And it can genuinely distort your perception of the reality happening around you as you try to comprehend the normalcy and the surrealness of the very sounds we are hearing. Truly strange, very mischievous in its own weird way, but there's also something really fun and playful about this one, and I think it's one of the most fun tracks on the album. Like, the surreal elements of it are so incredibly surreal, but I also think it's also one of the most fun and one of my top favourites out of the tracks here. And so, let's move on to the final track of this compilation though. Presque Rien ends with the final composition of Presque Rien No. 4, La Remontée du Village 1990 to 1998, which can roughly be translated as Climbing the Village. And this, I'd say, is a very interesting way to end this entire composition, as it's arguably a culmination of everything we've discovered thus far from listening and absorbing each and every recording on this album. And the accompanying text, it adds a little bit of context for us. But the true understanding comes from listening to the composition itself, I feel. But, of course I'll read out the text, which is as follows. I always hesitated before releasing a Presque Rien. For instance, it took 2 years for the first one to come out, and things went on this way. The fourth one took 9 years of hesitating. But here it is. Perhaps this is a real Presque Rien, fake where reality and lies mix. This is the ascent into the old town of Ventimiglia. Sorry, not sure how the name was said there, but an interesting piece of text. This is perhaps one of the hardest things Ferrari seems to have worked on, it seems, but the results of years of his hesitation and working on the composition results in, as he, even in his own words, a perfect blending of natural field recordings and abstract sounds, resulting in such an incredibly surreal experience where our perception is constantly shifted and moved by the slight occurrence of mysterious sounding effects. And the narrative of this composition, it plays out so much like Presque Rien No. 1, where you have a very natural sounding field recordings, perfectly establishing the scene of this old town of Ventimiglia. Still don't know how to say it, sorry. Slowly going about its day in ordinary fashion, the sounds of people chatting and talking, children playing, etc., etc. But the more this one plays out, the more weird those sounds start to become as they become distorted or changed in just slight little ways, it feels, adding a surrealistic element to what it is we are hearing. At times it sounds like the field recordings were put through some sort of vocoder of sorts, whilst others are turned into weird stuttering transmissions that it makes it feel like our, perception of it is being disturbed by something. But again, there's something very playful about it, so delightful in the subtle manipulations of the sound recordings, making it, rather impossible to comprehend what's real and what's not, especially when you consider, Ferrari's, background in constructing compositions from, such an array of sources. Like, you consider how the first one is just, completely structured, Foley sounding editing, essentially. It's really hard to tell what's an actual thing and what isn't. It's very weird. But, in this one, is it, you hear so many things, the sound of a church bell, for example. Is that the sound of an actual church bell ringing, or is it an edit by Ferrari to help move along the narrative? We just don't know. And it feels like when this one approaches the ending, everything just gets twisted into this incredibly strange experience where it feels like a real twisting and distorting of reality itself, before it all just returns back to normal. And we're back on our feet. A truly surreal experience, to undertake. And yet, after listening to the entirety of this album, it's perhaps not even the weirdest thing we have heard, but rather just a perfect expression of the very core notions and ideas of Presque Rien itself as a project. And so with that, we've essentially covered the 4 tracks released on this compilation version of Presque Rien, and to be fair, whilst I've never been the greatest fan of compilations themselves, I think this is a particularly special compilation, as it comprises 4 Presque Riens by Ferrari, and expresses to us, as a result, an unintended narrative that becomes more and more strange and surreal the more you progress into it. And so, a little bit of story time, because story time is fun. So when I listened to this version of Presque Rien, I was commuting on the train up to London for band practice, of course. And I was listening to the first track, and I genuinely remember thinking, like, oh, this is a nice album of field recordings. I wonder where this will take us, you know? Which, looking back on, is kind of funny. And to be honest, the first track is a wonderful ensemble of various field recordings, you know, and at the time I had no idea to the severe editing that had occurred during the composition of this one. As mentioned, I thought it was just Luc Ferrari wandering around the village in real time. And so, as things go, I just thought it was a relatively normal sounding track, and it was just really nice and pleasant to listen to. It kind of just drifted me off a bit, like, you know, I was just sort of having a nice time. And then track 2 came on, and I remember being a bit sort of confused, but a lot of these surreal and unusual elements really just went under the radar for me, and I just had no idea what was going on. But it was also very subtle, and I was still fooled by the appearance of that first track, I think. And my listening up to the second one failed to hear anything unusual at all until I got to the ending of it. And that loud thunderclap, that just wakes you up and jolts you. It forces you to listen very closely to the following sound. After which we were given these sort of weird percussion type things. And I remember thinking that this was incredibly strange and unusual, and I was unsure of what was going on as a result. And from there, we moved on to track 3. And by this point, I had arrived in the practice room, I was getting ready to set up all my pedals and everything, and so I was continuing to listen to the album, and I genuinely remember that when that distorted drum pattern or whatever it is just started playing, I got incredibly confused as I was trying to set up my pedals. And I don't understand exactly what it was that was going on, but it was like reality itself was getting distorted for me in this really unusual way, purely by the appearance of these unusual sounds, and I genuinely found it difficult to get anything done. It's such a peculiar, unusual story, but I genuinely found it quite fascinating in retrospect, And then as the album progressed onto the final track, everything settled down, I was able to get back to my bearings, but I remember thinking how incredibly surreal and peculiar the whole experience was, so I just thought it'd be worth mentioning here. But yeah, with that, we've essentially covered one of the strangest but genuinely fascinating albums I've ever come across, Even if unintentionally, the sequencing of this album, of this compilation, has resulted in one of the most peculiar experiences I've had listening to an album for a first time. And as a result, it becomes one that I'm always returning to because I just love discovering more and more about these recordings by listening to them. And re-listening to any Presque Rien is such an exciting experience when you hear and discover new things that weren't so apparent the first time you heard them. A certain sound, a voice, a combination of frequencies interacting in peculiar and unusual ways, or... All in all, the whole thing is just such a fascinating project that really rewards those who sit down and actively listen to the compositions. And I would say as well, it kind of punishes those of us who sit down and just try to just let the recordings just go by. But there's something kind of funny about that, I feel. But it's such a fascinating project. Like what I like, it showcases the fascination, one man had with the world that occurs all around us, essentially, The sounds that naturally happen, and how those sounds can be intertwined within each other in such fascinating and unusual ways. And the sheer scope of Ferrari's work always fascinates me as well, since discovering from Presque Rien. Ferrari has such a wide range of releases, so many fascinating albums and fantastic projects, and it's easily one of the most fascinating bodies of work to dive into, I feel like, and one of the best explorers into music concrete and field recordings, I would argue, truly influential to so many people, I feel. And so just to waffle on a bit more, just a little bit more, there's a real fascination to a project like this. One, as mentioned, one that has had such an influence on experimental abstract artists that are even working to this day, I feel, I'll say here, throughout so much of Weird Music episodes, I keep returning to Presque Rien, to Luc Ferrari, and discussing that very album especially when it comes to the sort of manipulation of field recordings to create surreal soundscapes. Essentially, like what I think it's an incredibly influential project that really examines the way you, as a listener or even a composer of surreal abstract music, it really forces you to examine the way you are perceiving and hearing sounds, which kind of goes back to Paulina Liverose as well, of course, right? But, of course, the act of listening to what we hear around us, interpreting it, and even abstractly presenting it in such a unique, different way, I can see why it's been so influential on so many people. Hence why I want to talk about on this show, as it's perhaps one of my favourite and earliest examples of abstract experimentalism within music, concrete, and field recordings. And by discussing Ferrari, we can make so much more sense of so many of the experimental artists out there, like a lot of the stuff we've been discussing and discovering on Fault Records, for example, strange manipulations of field recordings, or even, something as, very peculiar and weird as St. Abdullah's in Sahala Land, It makes a little bit more sense in the grand scheme of things, I feel, And it's wonderful that this, rather playful experimentation of natural sounds into abstract sound, it helped pave the way for so much more experimentalism, even to this current day. I feel like a lot of experimental artists owe a lot to Luc Ferrari, and have easily been influenced by his incredible body of work. And I'm just really glad that I was able to discover it through these experimental artists as well. Because easily one of the most rewarding albums I've ever come across. And so with that, I think we're going to come to the end of our episode of Weird Music. I have to say, a phenomenal project by an individual fascinated by the sounds of the everyday world existing around us and blending reality itself with surrealistic elements to create wholly unique listening experiences, I genuinely cannot fault this kind of album. It's an incredibly specific recordings edited together from so many sound resources, some manipulated, some presented as they are, but all presenting incredibly strange stories that pull you along this really unusual narrative. It's so bizarre, but as mentioned, so incredibly rewarding. And, it's something about the way Luc Ferrari does it, it's just so interesting, and I just love how his works result in the most interesting of details becoming all the more apparent as you listen to him. Each time you listen to his works, you just discover so much in it. Some parts are loud and bombastic, other parts are subtle though, but it all results in that weird journey that he's presenting. And so with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. As mentioned, the link below to Presque Rien by Luc Ferrari is there, so by all means go check it out. If you know other albums by Luc Ferrari as well, feel free to let us know in the comments so we can discover more of his amazing body of work. And so with that, I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.
On rejoint la ville. On va monter par là.